I never knew words could touch deeper than hands. But that day, when I found that forgotten piece of paper on the park bench, carefully folded yet clearly abandoned, it felt like I'd stumbled upon a secret whispered straight to my heart. The unfinished verse, written in ink with firm, elegant handwriting, seemed to know me. Not my name, nor my face, but the cracks in my soul. It read, "I sought you in echoes, in eyes that turn away, in prayers that end before the Amen," and stopped there. The page ended without resolution, without conclusion. But the way those words wrapped around my ribs made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that I truly existed. My name is Andriele, and I am the pastor's daughter. That always came before anything else I was. Not the girl who loves to write, nor the girl who cries easily, nor the woman who thinks more than she should for her age, but always the pastor's daughter. I grew up surrounded by invisible expectations that told me how to walk, who to talk to, what to wear, when to smile. No one ever needed to lock me up because I learned early to be my own jailer. The only space where I could breathe was on paper, a hidden notebook tucked inside my nightstand drawer, disguised among prayer books, where my feelings spilled out as poetry. Verses that would never be read by anyone, not even dared to be spoken aloud by me. Writing was my only secret sin, but the poem I found that day felt like it had been torn from me, even though I'd never written it. It was like being seen for the first time, not with eyes, but with understanding silence. I sat on that same bench, the paper in my hands, and right there, with my heart racing, I wrote a response. I didn't revise, I didn't censor, I just let the words guide me as if my hands knew more than my reason. I folded the paper again, leaving space at the end as if to say, "If you want, continue." And I placed it back in the same spot, praying the wind wouldn't carry it away. The next day, I returned. The bench seemed to be waiting for me, and the paper was there, but with different handwriting, a new response, a new verse, a new shared secret. My chest burned with fear and joy. From that moment, our exchange became a ritual, always in the same place, at the same times. We didn't know who the other was. I didn't know if he was young, old, kind, or dangerous. I only knew there was someone in the world who saw me, who answered me not with advice, but with poetry. And that, to me, was already more intimate than any touch. Over time, I became dependent on those verses, like someone depends on air. His words were a mirror where I finally saw myself. On the days the paper wasn't there, I felt an emptiness deeper than absence. I didn't know his name, but I already loved him. I loved the way he wrote as if whispering secrets to God's ear. I loved that he too left his verses unfinished, like me. Because somehow we were two pieces of the same sentence, lost but searching for the same ending. And then one day, he left an invitation. A short note, no poetry, just a place, a time, and my world froze. I stared at that piece of paper like someone facing a cliff. Everything we'd shared until then had been without faces, without voices, pure words, without judgment. If I went, it could ruin everything. But if I didn't, I'd never know who he was. And for the first time, I wanted more than safety. I wanted truth. I decided to go. And that afternoon, as my feet carried me to meet him, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the pastor's daughter. I was someone who chose. When I saw him for the first time, my heart forgot how to beat in rhythm. He was there, exactly where the note said he'd be, leaning against the wooden railing by the lake, holding an open book in his hands, as if waiting for another line, not a person. He was younger than I'd imagined, but with an ancient air in his eyes, not old, but lived, as if he carried too many stories for his own shoulders. He saw me approach and didn't flinch. He just closed the book slowly and smiled as if to say, "I knew you'd come." And in that moment, everything seemed to make sense. We didn't exchange words right away. We just looked at each other long enough for the silence to say everything necessary. I sat beside him with trembling hands, and only after long seconds did he break the silence. "You write like someone who bleeds with elegance," he said, not taking his eyes off the horizon. My throat tightened. It was him, the soul behind the verses, the one who had slipped into my intimacy without ever touching me. I replied softly, "And you write like someone who hides pain in the bottom of their pocket, like a clean handkerchief that's already wiped away too many tears." We talked little that day, but felt much. I learned his name was Levi. He lived alone, a bit outside town, sustaining himself with odd jobs and manual work, selling custom poems for people who needed words but didn't know how to say them. He told me he'd been writing since he was a child, as a way to escape a harsh childhood where no one listened, and speaking was dangerous. He said he learned to write for himself, until one day he realized he could write for others, and that's how he survived. In the days that followed, our meetings became frequent. Sometimes we saw each other. Sometimes we returned to exchanging papers. There was something sacred in that middle ground between presence and absence. He didn't press for answers. He never asked about my family, my life at church, my cloistered routine. He just listened, like someone who knows pain needs time to turn into words. And maybe because of that, I started opening up, little by little, like someone removing their shoes before entering a sacred place. I talked about my father, the respected, admired, feared man. About my mother, sweet and faded, as if she'd forgotten who she was before being a pastor's wife. I talked about the hard church pews, where I learned to silence my own voice to always hear others. I talked about the late nights when I wrote verses in fear of being caught, as if feeling too much were a crime. And he listened to everything in silence, his eyes glistening as if each of my words cleansed a wound he carried too. It was there, between confessions and shared silences, that I realized I was becoming someone else, not because of him, but because of myself, the freedom he awakened in me without demanding anything in return. Levi didn't set me free. He just showed me I already held the key. And that's why I started to fear, because what grows too beautifully in a land of rules is always at risk of being uprooted. I woke up that morning with a strange feeling, as if something had shifted inside me during the night. The routine of the house was the same as always. Strong coffee on the table, my mother sewing in silence, my father already rehearsing Sunday's sermon with the Bible open and his brow furrowed. But I was different. It was as if my body still followed the usual script, but my soul no longer fit there. Every step I took in that hallway, every automatic good morning, all sounded like a distant echo of someone I no longer was. It happened slowly, but with force. The more I met with Levi, the more I found myself. Poetry, once a silent escape, became my way of existing. I started writing with urgency, as if afraid the words would slip away if not spoken, and as a result, I hid more. Not just verses, but feelings, changes, small shifts in behavior. My parents didn't notice right away. They were too busy with church duties, the appearance of the perfect family, choir rehearsals, and the marriage counseling my father gave, as if he had love to spare, until the whispers began. In a small tone, nothing stays secret for long, and even if no one had seen us together, it only took a closer look to notice something in me was different, less obedient, less predictable, more alive. The church ladies started looking at me with a kind of concern. that goes unnamed. My father stared at me longer during meals. My mother started entering my room without knocking. I noticed. But I continued, because there was a place where I was free, where I could say anything without fear of correction, where love wasn't a duty, it was a choice. And Levi was that place. It was he who showed me there were other kinds of faith, not the one that teaches us to fear the world, but the one that teaches us to embrace ourselves. He spoke of books I was never allowed to read, of artists who turned pain into art, of broken lives that still found beauty amid ruins. He told me I wasn't wrong for feeling too much. I'd just been surrounded by people who learned to feel too little, and I loved him for that. Not with the reckless urgency romance novels promise, but with a rare peace that comes from knowing someone sees you and still chooses to stay. Our love was made of small, understood silences, of glances that said, "I understand." It was delicate but real, and that's exactly why it began to threaten everything around it. The morning my father called me to his study, with the Bible open and his face hardened, I knew he knew. Not how, not by whom, but he knew. He looked at me over his glasses and said with a calm but cutting voice, "You've been straying from the word." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I took a deep breath, trying not to tremble. "I've been getting closer to myself," I replied. He didn't shout, but the silence that followed was the loudest I'd ever heard in my life. That night, I wrote to Levi saying it might be better if we stayed apart for a while. I wrote with blurred eyes and sweaty hands, because each word felt like a goodbye. I didn't want to give, but I wrote, and he didn't respond. Days passed, and the bench stayed empty, the park silent, the verse, at last, unfinished again. Time, when the heart mourns something still alive, is a polite torture. It doesn't rush, doesn't bleed, doesn't scream. It just drags, dry, demanding every second. After my separation from Levi, I went on living in appearance. I woke up, helped my mother, went to church, smiled at the ladies, and listened to my father's sermons with my eyes lowered. On the outside, I was the perfect daughter again, but inside, I was rubble. There was no more poetry, no words. The notebook stayed closed for weeks. No verses came. As if my soul, in protest, had gone silent along with him, I avoided the park. I took other routes, and yet in every corner his name seemed to hide. In the breeze that touched my face, in the smell of the leaves, in the way the afternoon fell. Everything was memory. Everything was longing. But there was fear, too. Fear of having betrayed my parents' trust. Fear of having let Levi go. Fear of having lost myself again. All that remained was the emptiness of something that never fully bloomed, a love interrupted by choices that hurt to my bones. Then the letter arrived, folded in quarters, inside a plain envelope, my name handwritten, no sender. My heart raced before I even opened it. My hands sweated, my breath caught. When I unfolded it, I recognized his handwriting, and I cried before finishing the first line. He said he'd left because he knew I needed to breathe without him nearby, that he understood my choice, but that he couldn't walk away completely without leaving something behind. With the letter, a new poem, beautiful, dense, farewell and hope woven into every stanza. But at the end, again an unfinished verse. And if one day among the ruins you return. And then nothing. It was a veiled invitation, a door left ajar, an echo of what we'd started and what could still be finished or begun again. I reread the poem so many times it etched itself into my skin. And in that silence I decided I could no longer live divided between what was expected of me and what made me alive. For the first time, I wanted to be whole, even if it meant leaving everything behind. I packed my things in silence. I didn't take much, just the notebook, the letter, and the verse that needed an ending. I left at dawn, before any words could stop me. My mother was still asleep. My father, likely already kneeling in prayer, didn't notice my empty room. I left with light steps, but my heart screaming. It wasn't a hurried escape. It was a silent liberation, and at the same time, a sentence. I knew that by crossing that invisible line between duty and desire, there'd be no return. But deep in my chest, there was also a strange certainty. If I didn't go after him, I'd spend my whole life writing half-finished verses. Levi was a few hours away, in a small town where poetry wasn't a crime, and where, according to him, people spoke less of God and more with their own hearts. It took me a full day to find him. I didn't know exactly where, only that he'd mentioned in his letter a blue house at the end of the main road near a forest. When I arrived, he was sitting on the porch, eyes closed, as if he knew I'd come. His expression wasn't one of surprise or relief. It was peace, the same peace I felt when I wrote in the dark of my room. We didn't embrace right away. We didn't run to each other like in the movies. We just looked at each other long enough for all the silence of the past days to be forgiven. Then he stood and offered me the chair beside his, as if saying, "Let's start again from here." And there, sitting side by side, like two survivors of the same shipwreck, we began to talk. Not just about us, but about everything. The pains that shaped us, the fears we inherited, the burdens we carried to please people who never asked if we were okay. With Levi, everything was words, but words with soul. He showed me his notebooks, where he kept fragments of stories that never ended. He said he'd always been afraid of endings because life rarely offers them for real. He preferred to leave things open, with space for pain and hope to coexist. I understood, because I too was made of gaps. We were two unfinished pieces, and that's why we were whole together. As the days passed, I stayed. Not out of impulse, but by choice. I discovered in myself a woman I never knew existed, strong, creative, intense. I started writing again, but without fear. With him, my words didn't need to hide. We began working together, crafting verses for couples, stories for children, love letters for those who didn't know how to say what they felt. And in every text, a piece of us healed. But the more I felt at home with Levi, the more I knew the time of absence wouldn't last forever. The town I came from still existed, my parents, the church, the eyes that searched for me in empty pews. And I needed to decide if I'd keep running, or find a way to return as myself. Not as the pastor's daughter, but as Andriele, whole. My mother's letter came like a breath from the past. Light, but heavy with meaning. It was handwritten, as everything she did was, with delicate, spaced-out script, as if she measured each word to avoid causing pain. It said my father didn't speak of me, but every morning he set an extra cup on the table. That the absence weighed in the house like a bell that never rang. She didn't ask where I was or beg me to return. She only said, "I love you, and I hope you're living your truth." It was in that simple last sentence that I realized, maybe, even without understanding, she knew. Maybe she too had swallowed her own dreams for the sake of peace. Maybe, deep down, she was telling me, "Go further than I did." Levi found me reading the letter, sitting on the porch floor. He leaned against the door, saying nothing. He knew. My silence spoke loudly. When I stood, I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, then just nodded as if saying, "If you need to go, I understand." But leaving wasn't the right verb anymore. I didn't want to flee or abandon. I wanted to integrate, to unite the parts of me that had once been at war. The obedient girl and the woman who now wrote with freedom. I returned, not to apologize, but to say who I was. The town seemed smaller than I remembered. The park, silent. The bench was still. There, the place where it all began. Before heading home, I sat there and left a new poem. My final verse, written with the steady hand of someone no longer ashamed of what they feel. It was an invitation, a bridge, a hope. I arrived home at dusk. My mother opened the door and hugged me as if time hadn't passed. My father took longer. He looked at me with a mix of hurt and relief. The pain in his eyes was silent, but no heavier than mine. We talked. Not about Levi, nor the church. We talked about faith, about freedom, about what it means to love someone who chooses a different path. It was hard. It was real. But it was a beginning. I didn't ask for permission to love. I just did. And the following Sunday, when I walked through town beside Levi, without hiding, I understood that some verses need to be written in plain sight, even if they disturb, even if they challenge, because there's poetry in living without fear. And our love, now whole, was the poem that had once lacked an ending. Some loves don't need promises to last, only the courage to exist. Returning to the town was like walking again through a house that was once mine, but with the walls painted a different color. I was no longer the same, and it showed even in the way my feet touched the sidewalk. Beside Levi, I no longer hid. I didn't rush. We walked like people who know they belong, even if not everyone accepts it. The park welcomed us with silence. The bench, now empty, seemed to remember. I sat there and felt the world turn more slowly. I had left a piece of myself in that place. And now, I returned whole. No one said it would be easy. The glances came first, then the whispers. But with time, respect came too. Because there was something in me that hadn't existed before. Resolve. I didn't need to explain myself. My presence already said everything. I didn't return to provoke, but to inhabit. Not to shout, but to remain. And with every step taken there, I rewrote, not just my story, but that of everyone who could never choose. The reunion with my parents wasn't a scene of immediate reconciliation, like in books, where everything resolves with a hug. It was a silent process, full of awkward pauses and measured words. My mother, as always, was the open heart. She welcomed me with tears in her eyes and a warm plate on the table, as if her way of saying, "I'm glad you're back," was to care without asking. My father, he took longer to look me in the eyes. For weeks, he spoke to me only through practical comments, as if still digesting that I was no longer the obedient daughter he'd shaped. But I didn't press. I didn't return demanding acceptance. I returned offering presence. And it was that presence, constant and serene, that began to crack the wall of silence between us. One day, over coffee, he said only, "I read one of your texts." He didn't say which. He didn't say if he liked it. But the simple fact that he'd read was a gesture bigger than any speech. There, without too many words, I knew something had changed. Maybe he'd never fully understand my choices, but now at least he respected them, and for me, that was already peace. Time stopped being a threat and became a companion. With it, I learned that some wounds don't heal quickly. They turn into scars we carry with dignity. Levi and I stayed together without need for frameworks. We weren't a picture-perfect couple. We were two survivors who chose to love without fanfare. There were no rings, no ceremonies, just the silent commitment to be, to listen, to stay when the world told us to leave. Our days were simple, but full of meaning. We wrote together, We lived on words and affection. We left poems on benches, letters on strangers' doors, like scattering seeds where there was once dry land. The unfinished verse project grew. The town, once closed in certainties, began to open in questions. Young people, women, men, who had once silenced themselves, now wrote. They found in words what life had tried to erase. And I knew, in every shining gaze at the end of a workshop, that we were doing more than poetry. We were giving back voices. The verse Levi wrote in the beginning, the one that brought me to him, was never completed on paper. But today I understand. It didn't need an ending. Because we, together, wrote the rest with our lives. Sometimes I find myself sitting on that same park bench, now worn by time, watching the hurried steps of people around me, and thinking about how it all began there, with a forgotten piece of paper and an unfinished verse. We still leave poems scattered around the town, some signed, some not. It's our way of reminding the world that every soul has something to say, even if they don't know where to start. Levi keeps writing, by my side, as he always has, quiet, attentive, present. Our love no longer needs proof or a stage. It's made of staying. And when someone asks what we are, we smile and give the same answer as always. We are the continuation of a poem that refused to die. What began as words became action. What seemed a secret became a path. And if one day someone finds our papers out there, let them know. We didn't write to be read. We wrote so no one else would have to hide.